Hello,
Hi.
you were early.
Well,
Let me just
oh,
hit a few things there.
oh. I was a bit washed. Sorry, the camera's a bit washed out. I can never get the lighting right in here. Oh well.
I can't actually hear you. Are you?
Sorry, I was just saying the yeah. No, I can never get the lighting right in this room. Anywho.
So yeah, I saw your emails and thank you. So what I need, it's probably very, very obvious, but I need to have a few things probably from Brendel on this
Yeah.
in written almost in code or pseudocode so that I can write that blue sky paper of this is how you take things in and out of VR. And I think an element like this is, yeah, kind of.
I mean, the chicken egg problem with this is that the elegance of visual metadata is you can essentially link to anything you like, and there's several things. Is well, how much do I take? Because you know, at what point does something become bloat? But obviously, if I have it to hand, it's immediately dereferenceable because I know I've got it. So I didn't even have to look local. I mean, I definitely know it's there. Whereas if it's external, I might have to go and get it. But then we question what's local. And I think the other things I thought about is, of course, ownership itself is incredibly complicated. I mean, and not just to split hairs, but in the sense that things like editing. Sometimes you might want it's almost the degree to which you can sort of pull something apart to play with it. But one of the things I'm finding experimenting with data at the moment is learning to be very, very careful that I don't do something that basically changes the master record, which is the original provenance. So
Yeah,
in other words, so in a sense, do I edit a copy, I guess is what I'm saying, or do I edit the real thing? And that's, again, these are all sort of nuances to feed in. I mean, again, they're only metadata. So in other words, it's a setting you make. I think they're there. So I'm ticking over these things because I'm trying to figure out in my mind what's necessary metadata. Because if we don't have it at the point where we want to use the thing that we're talking about, then we're stuck or we're forced into a bad choice. And what can be treated as nice to have. For instance, one of the things is you might think in terms of the sharing is almost think of it in terms of a privacy thing. So I want to take this into the room so I can see it. I might want it to be only seen by me. Might want it to see only by members of the current meeting. I'll leave aside the wider thing. Let's leave aside the sort of the whole world watching. But the point is it a thing that only hi Peter? Is it a thing that only I want to see, or is it a thing that everybody can see? And then from that level, that opens up the thing of, well, if they can see it, can they do anything with it? Peter, we're just mulling on issues of sort of privacy / visibility when moving objects into the VR space.
Yeah, yes, because it's very, very easy to do a demo with all kinds of cool things floating about. But the question is, how do you get them? How do you hide them? How do you take them out? How do you share them? How do you use them? And how do you re-edit them? And by ownership, what I mean is a little bit intellectual ownership, but also which system. Is it the operating system that owns it? Is it a PDF document that owns it in Visual Meta? Is it the application that owns it?
Well, you've got two sorts of ownership there as well, unintentionally, in the sense is because we need to be careful in terms of saying when we say owns it is in a sense almost manipulates it within the software sense. Whereas I understand you to mean in a sense, if there's only one copy and we all walk away, who gets to walk away with it? You're thinking of that ownership in those terms?
Not really, because the example that was in the PDF earlier today is I've written many lists to you guys in the first PDF document, and we all do that, and it's quite useful. But then once that is done, you keep writing them forever. I mean, transclusion is, of course, a conceptual model here. So the point I'm at is where I write it, name it, that list in the document. So the document, now I have to think about the interface and author, but that's, fun. I then share it with you guys as a PDF, and maybe one of you decide, and this is very much about the library discussion we had last time, where we talk about table of contents and book covers. And you decide that you want to have a look at all the lists in our journal, for instance. So that now becomes a trivial thing to display. And one of the lists is, this is a list of potential projects. I want to work on that. So you pull it out, put it on the side, somewhere in space. So now the question is, what is that now? Is that still a part of the original document, or is it something that the software room we're in owns, but it has full visual meta citation to where it came from, etc.
Well,
and
then,
and then Mark, you enter the room, because so far one person, and you see this thing.
Mm-hmm.
How do you then grab it? Right? How do we decide that this is now also yours?
Well, just stepping back a second. So, I mean, when the thing arrives and you pull in a list, this list of lists wasn't there until you asked it. So at this point, it's just a constructed thing. It hasn't arrived. It is literally only exists in the space because we've created it there. So that's an important thing. So it starts being nothing. It literally is an evanescent thing. And I see to Peter a second, see his hand up, that exists there. So in other words, we actually have to define. We probably need some sort of definition, because if we keep having to, if we end up with a thing that's a bit like the early Windows 2000, where it's kept saying, do you want to do this? People sort of give up. So you might have to have a preemptive identification that you might clarify later. As to who, I would say that in the VR space, that there's sort of, I'd view the ownership in the level of privacy, and then control. I mean, I think back to the days when I worked with controlled documents. Some people never knew they were there because they never got to even go to the place where you even knew they existed. Once you got through the door, you might know they exist, but you couldn't necessarily look at them. And if you were allowed to look at them, then you could do things. You can change pages around. So that's perhaps one way to look at a model. Peter, you had a comment.
Yeah. I think once we start thinking about ownership, we have to sort of step back and address the issue of authority control and have a federated directory of all the people who've been creating data in this space. Now, once we do that, we can make it everyone's responsibility to update that federated directory with what their current contact information is. And I actually took an unsuccessful run at, there was a task force inside the United Nations that was addressing copyright issues. And at one of our law events, we had a speaker from that group come and talk to us about the things they were doing. And afterwards, it just struck me as how incredibly brain damaged our current system is of making people hunt down rights holders instead of making it incumbent upon rights holders to make themselves readily found. Since the original rights holder, if he cares about his rights, should have primary responsibility and obligation to make it painless for people to find them, instead of having to try to track down, oh, let's see, now he died, but we're within 75 years of the guy's death, so we got to try to figure out who his estate is. Oh, wait, the estate sold the rights off some publishing house for some money. Where did the rights go now? Oh, they might have delegated them off to some other group, but only a piece of the rights. Because one of the big things in law is that rights are not an atomic monolithic thing. Rights can be infinitely portioned, broken up, and respliced a million different ways. And that's really great because it makes it easy to monetize things that couldn't be monetized otherwise. For instance, Froda might decide that he wants to release the rights to his dissertation for conversion into a manga. And all he would sell is the rights to turn his dissertation into a manga, and he'd reserve the rights to turn it into an anime. And if the manga went really well and someone wanted to make an anime based upon the manga of his dissertation, they'd have to go and renegotiate the rights. So what I argued to the UN group was that, guys, why don't you set up the master rights holders directory, and then everyone can register the things. And if you own an orphan item out there that no one knows where it is, you can go declare that you are the actual right holder. How you do that can be ironed out in details, whether you'd have to put up a bond if you wanted to do it, or whether we just take your word for it, but at least put that mechanism in place. Now, if we're setting up a new space, it'd be much easier to build that in from square one. And once it's painless to get in contact with the rights holders, which means that if I'm changing my email address within so many days, I will promptly update the system. And as soon as I update the system, it will resend me any communication that went to me during that last 7 days or whatever it was before I updated it.
That was a slightly different issue, though, to the one I was getting at, which is, you're absolutely right. And so, in other words, so we know,
And now I'm circling back. So give me a second.
we sort of know who the contestants are. I mean, if I step to the more trivial level of, not necessarily something like a book or thesis, but I'm showing you my shopping list. So this is not something of. I'm picking something deliberately of no great intrinsic worth, so we don't fall into the sense of the whole value thing that can otherwise creep in. I mean, we can get to that there later, but if I brought the shopping list in and I'm showing it to you, I'm just wondering if the physical space as it exists at the moment gives us any clues as to how we tear this down. Because obviously, if I take a piece of paper out, it is self-evident, unless it's magic paper, that people in the room who are sighted can see it. First stage of revelation. But I may hold the face towards me and not show you what it is. I may not tell you what it is. But that's kind of obvious. So, we take something to 3D space. I suppose the question is, and given that we've talked about the fact that if I have a document in a 3D space, that just because I'm stood somewhere, I'm literally, as it were, in a different point of view in the 3D space, why should it be that I actually had to literally turn the object around to see the face that interested me? So if that's the case, there's a question, as I take my document into this space, it is effectively being revealed unless I've placed some impediment in its way to say, there's a thing here, but you can't know what it is. I mean, I think we have to also accept, in a way that I know we went through a painful stage in the early days of the web, and people said, well, I put my photograph online and someone took it. And the answer was, no, they probably didn't take it in that it wasn't like they crept into your house and stole it off your mantelpiece. They saw there was a picture in front of them, which they thought that's useful. And there was nothing to say, thou shalt not take a copy. So there's that thing we're going to have to
right. It's more like you put a billboard in front of your house and they took a photograph of the billboard while driving down the street.
Yeah. And so I think there's there's that pragmatism built into it. So I guess it's the thing of if you assume that you take something into a space and you haven't preemptively set a privacy because it's something very special and you don't want people to know what it is, but you might be happy that people know that there's something there, or you need it. Now, bear in mind, in the software space, I could choose to have a whole lot of things that are visible to me that aren't visible to you, which is something we can't do in real life. I can't hold this up and pretend that you can't see it.
Well,
in the space we're in.
That's a very interesting point, Mark, because what you can do is take it out of frame. So I think we probably have something similar in AR, VR, where with the Oculus, we have the Guardian area, which says inside, outside. Maybe we'll have a public shared for the meeting, but anything we put outside there, we have to manually put in or points.
So that's a good point, because I think what that's actually saying is that there is a boundary, even if it's sort of conceptual, that when the object passes that boundary, it passes into a more public space than has hitherto been the point. And you still may have various privacy labels or sort of things regarding some of the data within that object. But yes, I mean, in the sense, yes. So we were just discussing about the fact that you can see this, but I can take it out of frame. So that's one simple form of privacy, because we were chewing away at the gnarly issue of, ownership. Pick your facet.
So, Brenda, I'm glad you're here. I have a very specific question for you that is probably over trivial. That for the ACM Hypertext series, Visual Meta was introduced 2 years ago, and this year I have 3 days to submit for a Blue Skies track.
Well, for the abstract, you got a week. You got a week after that to write it.
Yeah, but yeah, that's true. But so what I think I should do this year is write on visual meta in augmented reality environments. So the thing that becomes the addition, because I've introduced visual meta before, so the thing that probably is useful is to say I have a document, it's opened up into this space, things are floating about. Now I'm closing the document, I need to write a new appendix automatically, of course, with all the attributes of where everything is. If you could help me write like a sample or dummy, even for one object, that would be really, really useful.
In terms of the spatial and relational information that might pertain to the fragments. And
Yes. By the way, I didn't thank you enough for your email reply to the.
oh, that's fine.
But,
Sorry, it was pretty long, but I just thought those are all of the things we've discussed here. So I thought I'd formalize the list of stuff in case any of the other folks in there.
Well, there's nothing wrong
One of
with
the
putting it into text, so it was greatly appreciated.
Yeah, no
And
problem.
it is now, of course, and all your projects are, of course, now up on the website, categorized and
Thank you.
organized and all of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's what we're thinking about. So the workflow that we're just discussing here is the following. And this is a little bit about the earlier PDF, so I'll make it brief, but I think it goes to the core of a lot of things. I'm sitting here writing a thing, and I decide that what I need is a list. So I write a list of stuff that, for instance, the example I used was potential data we will have in this environment. So they're just words. And then in my software, there is some kind of in an interface interaction where I must give this list a title. So that's all nice. That means when I'm writing in Author, I can collapse and expand. I get all these affordances, but now I export it to Visual Meta. The Visual Meta knows the title of this list and it knows the items in that list. So then we go into an augmented environment where, reflecting on covers, table of contents, and all that stuff, I say, someone else says, Mark, let's say, I want to go through everything in the journal that is a list. I want to see all the list we've had. You know, that's easy. He has it on his system. Here they are. One of them is interesting. So he pulls it out. I really need us to discuss what happens from that act, because it's now, to do a demo, of course, super easy, but to have it have some kind of meaning and value, when that is pulled out, it is coming from a specific document, but that document could potentially disappear. So that's one thing. So I would like it to be an object that has the visual meta attached. Of course, that'll be hidden now, so that he can then put it into a new document if he wants to. But also, if we enter the room, the rest of us, and he has a few of these things floating about in his public space, not hidden on the wall that we can't see, we should be able to say, oh, I need to work on that list and take it into our work. So, you know, where it is stored, how it's handled, I call it ownership, not a very good term. So that's the beginning of it. But then one thing that I think would be amazing is if Peter then says, oh, hang on, I'm working on that bit. He puts it in his thing, goes home, works on a document, and then he changes it. Publish it as a PDF with Visual Meta again, and it's published as based on. So then we can have a citation tree over time showing who has worked on this list and who has changed it. Because lists are pretty important in many environments, right? So now that I've said too much, do you have a perspective on how this should be handled?
So the sort of the passing around of sort of shared views of a thing with somebody making a hard change to it. I mean, nothing jumps out at me other than being able to see those links, but I'm also conscious that those links become spaghetti very quickly. I have heard that they are it's less the case in 3D, but you know that really only forestalls the inevitable. So, I
Well,
but we do have
visually-
sort of.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say visually that should be able to be turned on and off. We definitely need to have Ted Nelson visual connection soon. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And this is yet another one of those we can have. So it's just just in a very practical terms, let's say you've decided to program this thing and you have been given this example set of visual meta stuff. You have this data to begin with. How would you run it through software to be able to do this kind of stuff? Talk to me like I'm literally 2 years old, please.
Well, so you know, the document itself contains individual fragments, and the visual meta will relate to either the totality of the fragments or to specific fragments in particular. And the way in which you'd sort of reconcile that is looking for addresses and anchors and figuring out which parts they pertain to, if there's paragraph numbers or if there are specific sigils that relate to this meta, this component of the visual meta relates to that. You know, you'd construct those things based on the size of the nodes that are identifiable and separable based on whatever accepted markup exists in it. And then you'd construct whatever sort of visual annotations that are appropriate according to all of the visual meta tags. And then you'd position them. You know, you can use automated layouts. There are more in 2D than there are in 2D, but in 3D. But things like Coral Heron Corin Herald. So there's the things like the Herald Corin Fast multi-scale algorithm for graph visualization. You know, so you may apply some basic graph visualization with the additional aspect of constraints that exist for. I mean, if they have explicit positions, then that's awesome. But if not, then you know you'd jam, you'd inform it based on the user or users of the system, their positions and vantage points, and prioritize certain clustering to be visible at those distances and stuff like that. So yeah, in terms of how people relate to it, that depends on what kinds of manipulation and input modalities they have. Like, you know, one of the challenges, if you were talking about co-present stuff, is that it's nice to have sort of a canonical persistent space, rather than having people have vastly different views of that information, because it means that they have less to relate to each other with. So one solve for that is that when you say grow data or shrink data, that kind of thing, what you're doing is actually shrinking or growing yourself in the opposite direction, such that if you want to become a tiny pipsqueak and get right into the stuff, then you can kind of see a different perspective of those things. All of those sort of the fluidity of those things really depends on how comfortable people are with sort of disintegrating the notion of scale, because a lot of people believe that specific real world scales ought to be kind of obeyed, and other people think that the manipulability of those things, a la tilt brush, is too good to let go of, and so they really enjoy that, as well as world of miniature as a mechanism for being able to navigate. Yeah, I don't know if there are any other things that triggers, but I'm conscious that other people have things that they want to see.
Yeah, well, I think about that. Peter, please go ahead.
Yes, few thoughts now. One is that when I bring the data into the system, I would like to be prompt at that point for whether the original source of the data is me personally, an external source of unknown provenance, an external source of known but unstated provenance, which of course implies that I'll have the ability to supply that provenance information later on if needed, but I'm choosing not to at the moment. So that's distinct. Now, at the point that I'm bringing in as an unstated provenance, ideally the system would prompt me at that point to record it locally so that if I do need to supply it later on, I won't have forgotten it by that point in time. So all that would be sort of local metadata attached to the item. And then I'm choosing what I want to reveal in world, which would be that it's unknown provenance, unstated provenance, personal. And then we could address the permissions issue at that point too. One thing that I always wanted, but never had, was an automated with permission system. So instead of just putting it out for anybody to use it, I could put it out basically with personal leave, and then the system would automatically get in contact with me through the authorship directory that I was alluding to before. And then I would see how you want to use it. So for instance, maybe someone wanted to make a commercial use of it. And depending upon the commercial use, Froden might or might not want that reference to visual meta to be there. Now, if it's a Apple or IBM commercial that's giving that as an example of a kind of functionality that they want to support in their systems, it might be highly advantageous for him to have them make that commercial borrowing of some representation from a visual meta talk or something. If it was some sleazy person in Nigeria of unknown background, he'd be highly suspect and might choose not to. Now, there is a very well-developed security model already in place out there. It's called an object capability model. And that's worth having a look at. There are actually a couple programming languages that were designed completely around that for tracking really finely grained permissions and only delegating the kinds of permissions that you want. So if the system made use of that and also pulled in sort of a type of usage ontology that we could develop, all of that stuff could be smoothed out and automated. And well, gosh, it would probably cost a fair amount of work to the legal community, but what the heck? I'm all about making life better for authors.
Appreciate that, Peter.
Yeah, Mark, yeah.
I think I have a little sort of thought experiment by way of trying to keep things simple, because one of the things I was needling about when Fred was asking me earlier today about the memo he's just describing things, and I'm thinking, well, to a certain extent, if we think for a moment of textual data, sure, to a certain extent there are two parts to this. Even in a VR space, it's the text is still effectively stored somewhere as the electronic ones and zeros that resemble that text. There is then the render, that's then how it appears, or if it appears at all in the space. And I was thinking, so to a certain extent, change is too hard. So if I get my shopping list out, I can tear it in half. Now, I haven't changed the contents of the list. I've changed the visual representation of it significantly. Whereas if I just change something on the list won't, in a sense, the visual part of the list, well, okay, so if I'm showing the letters, they change, but effectively I can edit the text without necessarily affecting the visualization. And I was thinking, as Peter said about, the thing of that you bring something in, you talk about permissions. The thing that sprung into my head is the problem of, it's another of the modal things. Did you pack this bag yourself? Well, yes, sort of, no, but well, I didn't make the clock that I packed in it. That was made by somebody else because I bought it in a shop. And so there are practical limitations as to what in the moment we can really know, because it's terribly easy to sort of abstract so we must answer all these questions. And so I can almost see that at this stage one might experiment with putting things into a sort of liminal space, which is your private onboarding area, and you might want to gesture this as, no, I know what this is, I just want to ram it through the special hole marked use with care, because that just sort of puts it out in the public space. Whereas if I wanted to set controls over it, which I hadn't preset, then I have this problem that I'm now out of the flow. And that's the note I put about the modal thing. If I say, right, you've made a list, you must now name it. Now I've forgotten what the list is about because I'm thinking about possible names for it. And I mean, this is always problematic in the sort of software thing, because you definitely need to put a label on something, but the moment when you need that label, sometimes isn't the best person to ask the answer. I mean, there's never an easy answer. Anyway, I just sort of throw that in the mix if it helps us get to the point, because I do think it's certainly if we're talking about text as opposed to anything that you might put in VR space, that the text is going to be a data object associated with or part of the virtual object. So they can be, in a sense, revealed or edited separately.
Yeah, I like the recognition that those two sort of manipulations have different implications. One thing that sort of reminds me of is I have a pretty strong desire to retain all of the state changes for a document and graph, and so it's nice to be able to kind of serialize all of those operations such that you have the ability to recover what the state of a document or network of documents is at any point along its timeline. I feel like that allows for context restoration, as well as potentially some other aspects of recoverability from a technical perspective. So yeah, it would be my preference to have those things. Another thing that I'm really intrigued by, and I know it's not a completely free lunch, but just the fact that, at least in the context of text, it's really small, and document and disk space and transfer speeds are really high, and so I'm intrigued by the possibility of leaning on document inclusionism, where you are fairly unperturbed about the idea of things growing pretty large, and have the ability to lean on, like I said, like Wikipedia style inclusionism of just like, if you want something, if you want a piece of something, you pull the whole thing in so that you have the ability to use it if you need. And that kind of solves aspects, or it forestalls aspects of things like link rot. I mean, you still need to have some reasonable limit on what size things are, because you can, as we have at work in Apple Markham, we'll have Keynote files and Photoshop documents that span to upward of 9 gigabytes, and funny things happen to computers when that happens. But I think in text the limits are probably a little further off. So I would be intrigued by the possibility of serialized systems that can retain the two distinct sort of operations that you mentioned, Mark. And I think it would be interesting to err on the side of, in the event that you want a piece of something, to take all of it and store it behind the scenes in case you want more.
Well, I mean, we're talking about what is an object in augmented space, and we're talking about how can we refer to it, and we're talking about when it loses its place. Because in one view, you could say that you take this list out, just to keep that simple example, and it's still actually data-wise where it was originally in the document. The only thing that the VR environment knows is it's now displayed differently. And when it's taken out of there, it goes poof. So the question is, when do we say that it is now a freestanding unit in this world, but at least one that knows where it comes from? So I think what I'm trying to do is something much simpler. I think Peter is going really far into a very important area. But I'm looking just as when I'm writing stuff like for you guys, just little think pieces or whatever, I would love it if one day Brandel just opened it up in some experimental workspace. But I need to know what it would be in that workspace. Because the thing is, we're sharing things in thin air. It's bizarre. And this is obviously the whole new world. That's so exciting. It's not like I send you a JPEG or a Word document. You know, I'm showing you a thing in thin air. How in the world do we, what is it and how do we share it? What is its tangibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think as with the list and the document that you mentioned sharing, when it changes, I think should hinge on the implications for use. One thing that I think mentioned that I object to in the past is the issue where too many editing applications store insufficient levels of opinionation about view state changes. And the idea that you're zoomed in into this particular piece of the Photoshop document. 3D apps are a little bit better at this because they're kind of cognizant that there is an importance to, I'm actually looking at the bottom left lug on the wheel well of this car, thank you. Whereas Photoshop and Illustrator store very little of the sort. And so, you know, and Word is, I'm sure, even worse in terms of and then most other sort of word processing documents. So we definitely have to have a lot more about not just the document, but what a perspective over the document might entail. And view specs obviously sort of render that to be, in the sense that a lot of the time people think that mere sort of zoom and pan actions over a document aren't a thing. I think view specs blows all that away in that it obliges people to be aware that that there is some manipulation that has some kind of stateful implications, if not for the underlying data, then for the view that inevitably has to be cobbled together because there's no single canonical view of what the document is. And so, yeah, I've lost my train of thought.
I have a quick thought listening to that, and I wonder if, you know, because it's really difficult at this stage, you have the chicken egg problem that, well, you could spend an awful lot of time building something and then find it wasn't actually quite what you meant to build. You know, while there are so many things in play. I'm wondering if what some way of pushing into this is to start to write a number of assumptions with no intent that they're necessarily right, but almost putting them there so you deliberately trip over them if you need to falsify that assumption. So, you know, when we say we're taking something into the space, start saying what we think we mean, just in words, because it's sort of quicker and easier to do. And it's just sort of a way of surfacing some of the background assumptions. And at this stage of the game, they're not even going near right, and they may be actually, you know, pitifully poor in the understanding of the thing. But I think that might help sort of tease out the space, because one of the problems working totally in the abstract is that this list of jottings, you know, something scribbled on the paper, has as much sort of relevance as a published book. They're all just things, and yet there will be, you know. So we need to sort of tease out some of these things as well, because if we begin to put an edge, even if it's a slightly fuzzy one to it, I think it makes it easier to put a handle around some of these things, because otherwise you're having to deal with everything from the tiniest to the, you know, the thing that's the, you know, copy of the United States Constitution against, you know, that bit of paper you found in the street that clearly don't have the same controls and relevance. Anyway, I'll shut up with that, but I think you get the point.
Okay, so jumping into this, in the document I shared that you replied to, I can't even remember the name now, but in that document, one of the projects I suggested, because Mark kind of pressured me in a good way into looking at projects, not just the other aspects, is a timeline, which of course we've discussed myriads of times. This, of course, comes into that. We need some sort of mechanism whereby these things can be communicated to the user's timeline stuff. You know, I have we have a trainer at the moment, my wife and I, and it's all very good. Plus, of course, we have the Apple Watch. It would be so useful to get all the health stuff on the same timeline. And when you're talking about editing documents, like in Author, like a lot of modern stuff, I do Command S. What does that do? It tells Time Machine that there's a new version. It's basically what it does, right? So if we can take these changes that you're talking about, Brandel, or edits into that timeline, and also significantly when we give each other stuff, like not necessarily a change of ownership, but when the thing that I put in space now Brandel takes, that's probably significantly useful for timeline, right?
Yeah. When I take potential, if not ownership, then viewership rights, exclusive or non-exclusive, that kind of thing. Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said about the view state stuff, like what it should depend on what we want to do with it. So in the case of your document that you're sharing, what is it that I need to do? If it's to sort of merely understand what it is you mean, then it's pretty likely that it's a document that that contains a linear-ish flow of information and introduction, and I don't read super well. I mean, I can. I've finished books before. I'm okay. I'm fine. But my preference is conversation. I really like having things introduced to me. I like people talking to me about stuff, and I like ideas being performed. Not huge on theater, but that's separate. So I think what I would like from a document is something that is presented in that sort of explicitly, literally discursive way, where maybe words appear, maybe sounds are played through the timeline of the narrative that you're laying out. I think hand gestures work a lot too. So.
Okay. I have to jump in for a second. Sorry, Peter. Right. Okay. Multimedia was rubbish because learning how to make a movie is a real skill. So you can't just.
Right. Authoring is onerous.
Yeah, authoring is onerous. However, and Randall, it's nice and positive for you to talk about your reading. We all read in different ways, and you're super intelligent and accomplished. So for people in the future may listen to this and have similar situations, may feel the same.
It was not to be self-effacing, to be clear. I'm comfortable with my
No,
and all those things. I'm just specifically with the modality of reading. Yeah.
Yeah, and in this community or the future text, that's important. I mean, I have similar issues myself. Editing, I can't do it at a certain point. I have to call Mark and we have a fight, right? But one thing that I would really strongly, I come from an artistic background. I went to Chelsea School of Art, all of that stuff. If we could come together with, of course, we have to do timeline, no question. But if we could also make a document and then not just do a voiceover, but do a presentation of that document, like the two ones I've written to you guys, because in this sense, I think we're quite intimate and we can be open and relaxed with each other. A lot of it is flow of thought rubbish, but I don't want to delete it at this point. I don't have an academic thing I need to withhold. So I've kind of written in the beginning, this is actually so-and-so, read down to here. If you want to read the rest, it's up to you, but you don't have to. If I could say that, and maybe have my hands turn the pages, and my voice is there, I think that would be a real and valuable contribution. So the issue you're talking about is real and important, and thank you.
Thank you. No problem. So to that point, and sorry, I'll be done in a bit, I promise, Peter. Is the performability of those authoring sort of hints and implications? The only thing that's been on our mind so far is being able to type letters and then put them in places and to some extent format them to have sizes. And so that's all we have. But if we have the ability to actually author gestures, point to things, and have other aspects of performance and unfolding be a little bit richer, then I think people will lean into it, because I think that there are, that's one of the things that is in tension with applications like Keynote and PowerPoint, is that there's this temporality that we are absolutely abundantly aware has these values, but we have such a dearth of mechanisms for being able to kind of assemble those things and then kind of perform them. And so there's a real tension that between those modes that hasn't been resolved by the tools, but in large part simply because of the input modes that we have available. And I'm really optimistic that with something a little more performable. Oh yeah, the last thing I was going to say about that is that, yeah, all software systems are formalisms, and you can imagine doing them with graph paper. You can imagine doing all software with graph paper, and some people occasionally sort of get giggles by encoding Twitter as pieces of paper, that notes that you would physically kind of write out. But the same thing goes for hand poses or motion capture data. You have like stick figures, and you say like this one goes up and then that moves there. And what's interesting is thinking like, yeah, that would be possible, but it's so absurdly dumb to approach the problem in that way because of all of the obligations of input. To one of the points that you made earlier, Peter, about the provenance of specific documents and the ownership of those fragments. Something that I think is that the as much as you can get simply from the context and from other pieces of information that like what people are doing, and being able to make good guesses is always better than having people encode that information themselves, because unless it's the information they specifically care about, then they're likely not to fill it up, and the quality of the information is likely to be bad. So that's the other aspect of it. Like because one has to understand and concede that authoring is onerous for everything but the very specific thing that the person intends to author at this moment, then coming up with ways of backfilling that or gently asking for it at the right time is really essential.
So I'll ask Peter to hold this thought since he's noted it down for a minute, because this is exploding into something. A couple of years ago, I mocked up a thing, and it's funny, Ventures didn't get it, where it was based on question and answers. So imagine someone famous, like a politician or actor or whatever, but also imagine someone on the other side of the world who you just don't know about. It works like this. There is a spoken or written question, that person answers. Another one, answer, question, answer. So you build up a database of question and answer. These would be audio, but of course transcribed for logic, right? So then in the future, let's say this is a teacher who's in demand, a student can ask that question and the avatar will answer, right? So it can then allow for many questions. The problem with it partly is the fact that most people don't know how to do video conferencing. So if it was video, first of all, you're going to have different clothing on every time. But most people really don't understand basic lighting and stuff like that. So it would look absolute shit. However, in VR, that becomes very different. So if we take it a step further, imagine this. For example, I make a presentation to you guys of a document that I've written similar to what we talked about earlier. You guys then ask me questions. I answer those questions. When done, those questions and answers become part of the visual meta or something. So the more time I present this work, with the more Q&A, it's encoded in the document automatically. So that, you know, it builds up, and that is available for people in the future. That could be like a new way where a document is just a starting point for something much bigger over. You know, because I'm very much about PDF into world, PDF goes out, very, very traditional, very, very conservative. But at the same time as we do that, we obviously have to try to invent completely new things. You know, so the fact that we have our avatars, we have all these things could be insanely interesting. And since everyone's still quiet, one little thing, when I do the transcripts, what the software also allows me to do is to change the voice based on what's being done. We've seen lots of research, but it's normally in use now. So you can actually teach it the voice. So that if the text changes a little bit, the voice will change what's being said anyway. So the whole thing about the video being a problem, and now we have Avatar, we could do the same with audio. Even if it's recorded in different situations and maybe different levels of tiredness, it can be processed in the future so that it's a uniform dialogue. You feel like you're talking to one person. Right, Mark.
Yeah, I keep thinking here in the sort of, I mean, the thing with the VM is all just metadata. The problem is that means that essentially everything's possible, but it's still the question is, so, but which are we doing? There is this disconnect, I think, between the our movement or our presence between the actual and the virtual or even augmented space, and what we think of ourselves doing when we move something into that space. Because to a certain extent, if I have a document on my computer, to move it into the virtual space, I'm going to have to wrap stuff. Well, I not necessarily wrap around it, but I need to associate it with further information. And I'm just sort of trying to noodle that, because I totally sort of with Brannell's point about the inclusionism and having sort of more state data. But I'm also conscious, you know, how big does my shopping list have to get before somebody points out that, wait a minute, you know, was it really worth all that effort? And I mean, I'm being slightly flippant, but there is a point to it, but because it's terribly easy to slide from one end to the other. And this is my sort of, this is what I'm trying, this is what I'm sort of noodling on. I'll just throw in one quick thing before it passes, and it's the idea that might appeal to Brandel is that, well, I'm saying it on camera, so it's clear my concerns about it. But I do have, because I spent an awful lot of my own spare time, I do actually have Ted Nelson's Literary Machines in ebook form, because I made it. And I've sort of got Ted to agree to let it out. We haven't got round to deciding where. And I'm careful about letting something that I know is very close to his heart just sort of disappear off into the ether, because it's one of the zeros. But within the sort of grouping here, I don't know whether that's something that, Brannell, you might find interesting. I don't know if, did I send you a copy before? I can't remember. I thought I did, but if I didn't, I will.
I don't recall receiving it, but no, that sounds fun to
it's
have.
It's EPUB 3
definitely.
form, so it's just XHTML. You know, I mean, you'll know what you'll know what it is when you see it. But I just wondered if that might be a nice point of getting us to something, the funky demo. I sort of, the other difficult part will be asking Ted and getting him to sort of really quite cotton on to what we're doing. But well, I'm here on the record saying I don't want to be playing fast and loose with his copyright material, but I think it is quite an interesting source and rather opposite to what we're doing.
Yeah, I also noticed after Bob Horn mentioned his book that it's on archive.org, which means it's there, whether he likes it or not. I'd love to know whether he likes it, because if not, then I prefer to try to find a copy to buy. But it's, you know, because it is explicitly attempting to mimic some plausible.
This one.
That's right. Yeah, mapping hypertext. I haven't looked for the other one, but I've sort of 40 pages through. I was looking at it. It's really neat. One of the things that's really cool is you look at like his enthusiastic discussion of virtual reality on page 244. It might as well have been minutes of one of these recent meetings, and so it's interesting to think of what, I mean, it's understandable what 33 years has done to his level of interest, but potentially this time it's different, and I mean that because of the technical sort of changes that have occurred over the way.
Yeah, I feel it. You know, reading this, the thing I keep having to tell myself is that, you know, remember that the artwork was sort of pretty much state of the art when it was written. So if it looks, you know, in a sense, I don't know if you can even see it at all, but, you know, that probably looks sort of terribly simplistic and old fashioned, but you got to look beyond the artwork. I mean, there's some really interesting ideas here.
Oh, no. I mean, I think I've said before, I was a professional medical illustrator for nearly 10 years. And that kind of thing does a very, very useful job. You know, when you're talking about glistening guts and arteries and things like that, it's nice to get a little bit more shading on there, but you know, you use the tools that you have, and that's that visual style strikes an excellent balance between being rich and lying within the constraints of the medium as it existed. So yeah, no, I wasn't poking fun at it at all.
Because that picks up an interesting point, and I think we probably got slightly cross-threaded about in our last but one talk when we were talking about tables of contents and things. Because anyway, well, as what I thought I was hearing talked about wasn't so much you know, dead tree libraries and this kind of thing, but more the metadata of the text. Which in the digital sense is a living thing, and we're talking about moving into a space where we can actually interact with that structure. So that's why I thought it was quite exciting, because I know its lineage is in, you know, old tech, but we're in a transitional phase, and I always try not to sort of get too absolutist about, you know, what may or may not travel forward, because I think at this point we don't know. But even if you didn't call it a table of contents, having something that effectively you could describe it as a sort of a tree of glosses, which is a perfectly fair description of it, which allows you to basically crawl your way into the corpus.
Peter, sorry for the big diversion, and Mark, let's not completely lose what you're talking about there, because that's especially the whole TED thing. But Peter, please go ahead.
Okay, going really, really far back, I had a couple of security thoughts, and one was that we might want to introduce a notion of eyes-only material that at the client side gateway to the system would be blocked and replaced by a peer-to-peer negotiation with the intended recipient to make sure that the data never gets into the system at all, in order to prevent any security holes that might be lurking in the system from exposing that data. If the data never gets entered into the system, we don't have to worry about your credit card number, your list of credit card numbers. You might want, for some reason, to let Mark Anderson have a look at it. You'd trust him, I'd trust you with that kind of information, but you certainly wouldn't want it to be in the system where a bug in the system implementation could potentially expose it to the world. So for something like that, you'd want to have some sort of an eyes-only marker, and the data would explicitly get routed directly over a secure pipe between the two endpoints that you want to have access to the data. And also, the clients could have some general patterns as filters on that kind of really sensitive data. So you could have a regular expression looking at social security records per se and credit card numbers per se. And if in any data flowing into the system, it sees that pattern, it would just X them out and make some sort of a little note that you could explicitly get around using an eyes-only peer-to-peer transmission. Now jumping forward, completely unrelated thought, we might really want to start formally rethinking plagiarism in this world. There's certainly lots of times where I've had ideas and references of uncertain provenance, and I will consciously not use that particular idea. I literally will write around it because I know that I don't know exactly where it was that I originally found the idea. So I can't explicitly reference the idea without the potential of someone coming with a big club down the road and saying, oh, Wassilka was sloppy, he was trying to steal Brandel's idea, when that really wasn't the case. It's simply that in my cognitive ability, I couldn't access the memory of it being Brandel that particularly gave me that idea N years ago at a time that I didn't think was going to be important to something that I was writing in the future. So in that respect, we want to have an explicit notion of an uncertain provenance or an unidentified provenance. So I can make it perfectly clear, it's not my idea. And I think I mentioned this in a couple previous chats, but I just want to recircle to it now, just to reemphasize that I'm not sure of the provenance, or maybe I'm sure of the provenance, but I might be wrong. And Mark Anderson reads it and he thinks that I might be off on the provenance. So he could make a little annotation. And then we need an agreed upon community standard that as long as we're adhering to the process of trying to progressively upgrade our citations and annotations, it won't be considered an act of plagiarism if someone's memory isn't 100% crystalline accurate. And also, I think we should start thinking about what we want to be a fair use in the VR, and as a community have some sort of a fair use manifesto that we could adopt and get into the literature, so that when judges down the road are coming and addressing the question of, is this fair use, there'll be some documentation in the literature that a court could look at to tell them, here's how people in this community were looking at these issues as to what should be fair use, and ideally even try to get rights holders on board to acknowledge what fair uses are. Because one horrible problem in the copyright law area is, and in law in general, until something gets litigated, it's just a big, murky landmine area that people avoid, because no one wants to be the one who's going to be the test case for a novel question of law. Now, even if you feel that it's highly likely that you would win, just the pure mechanical costs of litigating the issue through to a conclusion are such that unless you're Elsevier, you can't afford to get a court to finally reach the conclusion that anyone in his right mind would agree to. And sadly, Congress and various legislative authorities around the world have never sat down and addressed fair use beyond general principles like how much impact is it having on the financial market for the item? Was it done with a for-profit motive? And you have a whole list of fuzzy factors. But again, everything is horribly fuzzy. And there's nothing that you can hang your hat on and say, here's the piece of legislation that defines fair use. There's a safe harbor that I know that I'm under, so I can go ahead and use it. So the more that we could do to crystallize notions of the academic community's views of fair use, the higher the odds are that a court or future legislature will iron this stuff out. Another beautiful example is orphan software and emulators of long dead systems. As a practical matter, anyone who you ask with the right mind would say, yes, it's a fair use. If someone can get a copy of Augment NLS running, it would be perfectly fair to create that. If you can resurrect a copy of a famous hypertext system like note cards or an early hypercard, that should be deemed a fair use. But the legislatures have never gotten around to formally addressing that issue, to give us a safe harbor, to remove the ambiguity. And in the presence of the ambiguity, again, because everyone's afraid of the cost of litigation, how it could wipe out the individual, even though he'd probably win, it doesn't matter that you'd win. And of course, this is what empowers patent trolls and copyleft trolls, knowing that the costs of being proven correct are so much higher than the incidental cost of writing off your rights and either not touching the thing or agreeing to essentially pay blackmail money to avoid the litigation level.
Right.
Comes into play.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, these are interesting issues, but I think probably for a while within what we're working on here, the act of publishing something, when you publish something, you're saying it is for the public. There will, of course, be, you publish within a specific community, and that's an interesting issue too, but I'm not sure if we're really ready to address, the walking before you're able to crawl the document in and out of places. Unless there are other perspectives.
Yeah, mainly I wanted to get that on the record so that we can come back to it in 2 or 3 years. And it'd be a good open topic for someone who's looking to do a PhD in law related to IP to pick up.
Oh yeah.
So this way I'm just trying to get it into the record so that someone can come back to the issue when they're in a better position to address it.
Yeah, in that spirit, Peter, I'll sort of not rebut per se, but sort of comment on each of those. So eyes-only client systems aren't really compatible with an open web unless you have the ability to revoke people's sort of credentials for being able to access things, punish them essentially for caching things that they have the ability to read. If a computer can see something, it can store something. And we've learned that with HDMI. There was people talked a big talk of being able to revoke specific sort of serial number licenses and things like that for a specific end pipe, so that if somebody found that a DVD player was stealing too many bits, then they could downgrade the bit stream that was coming through it. I don't know officially where that went, but I haven't seen any evidence that it ended up happening in the long term. The second one is that trust is a minefield for people to be able to manipulate or annotate other people's documents. If you're having something in a truly open web, that's something that's been absolutely shocking for my worldview, my own world, in being in contact with the actual web people, the people who build Chrome, the people who build Safari, is that it's such a fundamentally untrustworthy environment that you have to be incredibly defensive. For all of the sort of the issues of JavaScript, the performance issues aren't really from the lack of type safety. It's more from the fact that it needs to be so closed down, sandboxed, and fenced in with all of these different type checks that, for the most part, when you agree to make something for Sony or Apple or Microsoft or whatever, then there's an entity, there's an agent that people can negotiate with, and that entity can be punished, and that sort of mostly keeps people honest. And that doesn't exist on the web at all. And so it's a much more untrusted environment. And so there are incredible capabilities that you can have for annotation and mutual manipulation of documents and stuff like that in a context where you can trust those people. And that's one of the things that I think universal scene description is going to fall into, is that right now it's all in Pixar. Nobody's worrying about one division of Pixar making nefarious changes to another one's. Lighting isn't at war with models at this point, although that who knows what's going to happen in the future. And the third part, this sort of related to those, is that I think limited fair use per se is at odds with the semantic web, in that if any given 30-second clip of a movie can be considered fair use to be able to include within a video, and it's possible to make linkages between all 30-second clips, then you have that video, and there's nothing that any one person did. It's the sort of the death of a thousand cuts that Isaac Asimov really liked to write about, in terms of being allowing robots to murder people without breaking the 3 laws. So, like, between all of those things, yeah, the scaling issues of actually expanding these things up to perpetuity for a public web are terrifyingly thorny. They need to be kept in mind in the context of people building it from the beginning. But I agree that it's worth thinking about a use that it can have right now with a more limited pool of people, because many a team has been driven mad by just one of those problems on its own.
Great points, Brendel. Thanks for sharing that.
Brendel, I've sent you an email, which hopefully will turn up while we're here, that's got a link to 2 of the bigger documents and some other ones that are, I've got a number of TED things which I've actually taken from the Internet Archive, but what I've done is I basically effectively retyped them in digital text form, because well, his writing is like mine, not exactly decipherable, and sadly in places he's written off the edge, and I've learned not to ask Ted, what did you mean there? So I can't remember, it was years ago, quite rightly. So there are bits, but what I've tried to do really for future selves or researchers is say, okay, so this is what was written. So that's in there. But Fred, you were asking about 7 issues. I just put another copy up. I've got all that stuff in a tinderbox, so I basically have it as a hypertext. The problem with the 7 issues is that he kept changing the terminology, and although Halat's presented it sort of 3 times, he didn't necessarily sort of link the pieces. So that's research of mine, really. I mean, I don't think you'll find that anywhere else. That was something I did for my thesis. Not that it's particularly erudite or anything, but it was just sort of trying to do that. I'd done it because it's such a canonical thing, and I got fed up with people saying, oh, but 7 issues. And I said, well, the world has changed. Some of the things here, really, we've moved on from. And I think you look at it now and think it's all a bit dated. Some of it's a bit dated, and it doesn't make it any less worthwhile of its time. But I don't know how much import it has for the current day. But anyway, it's there, and I'm happy to help. If people want it in a different form, I can do that.
Mark, all I meant was, when I referred to it, was it's a list. Well, we're talking about lists, so that's an example of a useful list that has been referred to, and it's a good one in our community. Did you guys have a chance to look on the website? I have a link to The Economist doing an article on the metaverse in China. They are investing a huge amount. Last year, over 1,000 companies, new companies, were founded with the name metaverse on the title. Well, the Chinese.
Yeah.
And they're investing so much in the hardware and software. So, of course, and also they're buying game companies too. A lot of this will be based on gaming ways of doing things, which is, of course, very interesting and very different from us, but we can benefit from it. But I think the amazing amount of money being spent in China on this says a lot of the technologies will get a lot cheaper, a lot quicker, and that's just really good news.
Yeah. My first CD burner, I think, was $450, and burnt in real time, and the technology was gone in 5 years.
Don't you remember when we were all joking going to the record shop? Excuse me, do you have any blank CDs? Ha ha ha! They don't exist. So yes. Anyway, right. So in terms of the basic, one of the beginnings here is what should I do for my Blue Skies paper of having Visual Meta in and out of VR? Yeah.
A very quick thing, I suppose I ought to ask. I assume VR is going to be used again. Visual Meta is going to be used in the Haptics conference again this year, or was it a one-off test?
It was supposed to be used again, but the people involved in my world have not had the ability to communicate with the right people for this year. I'm just trying to leave as many keywords out of the transcript.
No, I can fill in the gaps from that, which doesn't surprise me at all. Which is a great shame. But you can still, the point is, it doesn't invalidate because your paper can refer back to, so the paper was in last year, and I think it's a really useful starting off point, because some of the issues we just raised today, basically you have something that is already being posited and at least trialed, as it were, as some way of effectively providing a backbone onto which to add all these necessary references, because as we've discussed, we don't really know quite what you need and in what volume, and what has to be local and what's at reference scope. But we sure as heck need something to put it into, and it sort of makes sense to me to have something that has been started with the intention of being, or the key parts of it being, readable for a while yet. Because obviously you're not going to want to print all the ones and zeros of some bits in the VM, but that can be easily referenced. But rather than, the worst case would be to find that someone said, we'll do that. What we'll do is we'll hide it as a sort of nested bit of information in some VR format, which I think would be a subpar outcome.
But Brando, yeah, what do you think? If we were going to do a test with this, what would we actually do?
Well, so one of the things that is good about VR is that you can put things at distances. You can have levels of sort of granularity. In the context of a map, it is its own level of detail, in the sense that when you look at the Thames and it's winding at this distance versus being able to actually go in and see where the Fleet River joined on and stuff like that. But text doesn't do that very well. So having the ability to encode the multiple levels of detail in the way that that Bob discusses in structured writing, and having a visualization of that allows people to fluidly transition between those things. I think that's a useful representational job for visual meta, and a useful visualization job for virtual reality in that context. The aspect of being able to hint at provenance in the way that Ted's visible links is useful. As one of the objections that I have to having visible links on all the time is that it's super distracting, and it really, for the most part, quite linear tasks of reading are interrupted by these things that you may want, and that's where that notion of view specs is essential. But again, just as authoring is onerous, so is sort of overly detailed sort of view state manipulations. And in the context where you don't have the ability to kind of gesturally make those things, and where you have to kind of commit to a long string of specific sort of assertions about the way you want to have something. Photoshop is much better in that you have the ability to kind of zoom in and out, but even that, as you must know, Frode, can become incredibly tangled in terms of the specific configuration of layers that you have on and off and stuff. And so finding sort of gestural and progressive ways through those problems is very valuable. And I think that the combination of virtual reality, hand tracking, pose tracking, all of those things, in combination with the richness of the data that can be leaned on to be able to make those selections and determinations as to the view state, I think those things work well together, and I think that could be the sort of the locus of the job that visual meta does in virtual reality. Does that make sense?
It does to an extent, but so I think if we look at it, the simplest way is we're now in a VR environment. Let's say VR, it's simpler. And I produce a document that has visual meta on it. And I decide that what I'm interested in is only the glossary. So I pull that out through some command or action. And now decide to move it about like on a map, because I can make the lines appear by selecting. Let's pretend it's exactly like it is an author. So as I select Mark Anderson, there's a line to Peter and that kind of stuff. When I'm done, I want to be able to write that constellation into a new appendix of that visual meta in that document. So the initial baby steps question I have is, how would that actually look? Of course, just writing to PDF from a VR environment, I'm sure require all kinds of APIs and libraries and all kinds of good stuff. But how can we write it in a way that this same environment can open that to the same view, but also it's reasonable to expect someone developing a different environment can read this, figure it out easily, and also support that same view?
Doesn't seem to me. I mean, the thing is, as long as your glossary is sort of structured in a way that it, isn't stored in some binary format no one can read, I don't think, it's just a goblet of information that passes around. One of the things you've got to. Sorry.
It's also where it is in space. That's what I'm thinking about. Like,
no, well, that's a different thing. If you want to, right, that wasn't clear from what you said. If you want to have the exact sort of three, if I think like one of those NODA diagrams, if you turned it into something like that, so you wanted the exact 3D position within a bounded area, that would be some more, but that's just I mean, sorry, I keep using that word just. It's three-dimensional data, so it's a bit more data, but the turning into the data that goes into the PDF is not going to be happening in a machine inside the VR. I mean, it's a computer function, so I don't think that's something that you have to concern yourself with. The more interesting thing is, okay, so what extra information would I take out in the VR?
My job is visual meta, so I do need to concern myself with that, right? And Brandel knows a lot of the, not just practical details, but the quality of life having dealt with the details. So that's why I'm wondering if we can take just one word and have it in one place and just write that in what looks like a BibTeX / visual meta style that makes sense. I could do it myself really easily, but I just know I would do it really badly in a way that doesn't suit the right kind of reading. So yeah, that's what I'm asking you.
Sure. So, but to Mark's point, what you would need is a 6 degree of freedom reference for whatever node transformation that you have. So if you understand objects to be anchored at their center pivot, then you'd essentially render that to a 2D billboard. Then you'd figure out where that center pivot is, and then you'd translate and rotate it according to the well, you probably use a matrix for it. So you have a 4x4 matrix of floating point numbers encoded that indicate it's 3D space. If it's if you have things kind of with local coordinate reference frames, then you'd need to rebuild that from the top down based on view transforms of all of the objects. You typically say like, this one is parented to that one, but it's a little bit down. This one is parented to that one, but it's a little bit forward and tilted to the side. So in the same way that any visual scene graph exists, just that. So USD is a pretty good model of it. You look at other things like GLTF, or look at the way that people discuss coordinate frames in applications like Unity 3D or Blender. Then that's what you do. Whether there are additional pieces of information about constraints, say that this thing needs to be on a horizontal surface of this size, then that's a determination that is only really now emerging. People like Timony West at Unity XR Labs. That Unity is the application platform that most people make most games on these days, and the other one is Unreal. But they both have pretty similar sentiments. I'm not aware of the level of effort Unreal is going into in terms of what they're doing with XR, but certainly what Timony's been doing is great. Where she talks about this sort of being able to apply constraints. So to your point about the portability of these views combined with the integrity of the sort of relationships is one of the things that's really interesting. Is like, do you need to have this on a surface, on a horizontal surface? What are the sort of appropriate bounds? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can we co-write a short paper on this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's out there. I would, if you watch some of Timony's stuff, then she's kind of discussed it and described it. I haven't used the XR platform toolkit. I'm not sure if there are legal reasons for that, but I haven't gotten around to it because I like to have more control than that, and I don't like Unity or C#. But it's a lot of the thinking is really interesting in terms of recognizing this is an augmented reality where the expectation is that you're going to be in a space that you have to kind of defer to some extent, rather than having a completely sort of pre-cleared area around which you have complete free reign. So there are benefits to that, but it also brings the richness and complexity of who left their toys on the ground again.
So Peter has been helpful looking at writing parsers and validators for visual meta, which is really great. So I'm thinking within this example we're talking about here, what I think would be really useful would be on this new appendix, when you close the document and you make it, it has the following information. It says which bit of the document was moved out of the document. It says several different origin points, because it may be related to the document itself, it may be related to the viewer, it may be related to a table. This, so what you're talking about there. So it has to explicitly say, these are the possible ways you can place it in space, right? And then what I'm thinking is we'll have a kind of a cascading hierarchy of detail. So it must have the word chocolate. That's what it is. It must be facing this direction. All of that basic stuff. But and then maybe literally a line below, it can say it was presented in this font and this color with this shader. So it keeps going into detail, but depending on the reader software, it can stop wherever is relevant. And if we can then provide somehow translators into Unity or even Blender, I guess, or whatever, into these, that would be phenomenally useful. For the actual boring stuff, if we find someone we can actually pay to code it, that might be useful, because then they will do it in a very different way than we do it from our passion perspective. Know what I mean?
Yeah.
So then, where would you envisage the cutoff between what? I mean, I'm imagining storing that much data in. Well, I just know from taking I thought very much visual meta in my thesis, and adding visual meta, it was about 60 pages of text on the end of the PDF. So whether you put all the 3D information in verbatim in the thing or reference it as a separate thing is something to consider, because there will.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that is the huge interaction section. I'm talking about a thing where I have a document, I pull stuff out, and then it is contained there. But as Mark and I was talking about briefly earlier today, when do you snap that connection? Right, that's also another issue, but that's probably an issue for the space. So that's why I would like it if the software space, whatever representational engine we're using, would know what this is with visual meta of its origins. But of course, this is when we're getting into real world complexities that we probably have to try things to see. But at least I should be able to explode a document. Because if I can't explode it, use it, and keep that, then who would want to do that?
An interesting thing that when I was hearing Brenna sort of describe how you codify the expected structure is, are you thinking that would be retained as a 3D structure, or are you also wanting to try and map it back onto a 2D? Because I suspect that would just add complexity that at this stage perhaps might be put to one side. I mean, it just adds, because in a sense, you can take a projection through it and collapse it, but of course, then you'll find that things sit on top of one another, and you're back into all the sort of 2D design things that we deal with all the time.
That would be a different.
Fine. Okay. Yeah, sure.
No, but it's an extremely valuable point, Mark, because if you have a 2D and a 3D, they shouldn't interfere with each other either. So at top of the hierarchy of noting, it probably should say this, explicitly say this is an augmented reality view, or this is a virtual reality view, depending on background. Let me just open the door to the family one second.
Because I've got one, I'm very conscious Peter's got his hand out. One sort of thing just pertinent to this, and it's touched on several people before, that, one of the tools I use has a way that it will actually show you everything. Well, basically it plots the network across a spherical face. And in fact, it's asked because the one I don't want to see the links half the time. I want to know that things are linked. And actually, what I really need to be able to do is to drop links in and out visibly without affecting or affecting the document. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand the relationship, and that's why it works really neatly in author, and Fred's manner of not having all the links rammed in your face all the time. Which is why I think that I always struggle with. I mean, I get what Ted was after, and it's a long way back, but it really only makes sense if you're doing what he was doing, which is looking at relative, edits of the Gutenberg Bible. It's not going to help you work out which is your more recent shopping list, or is unlikely to. So, the notion, I think it's the notion of the line. So that actually, I think the wrong thing is now we have the technical affordances we have. The visual part was at its time, I think it made sense. Now I think I think of it more as it's having the affordance of being able to show or to compute or to use even just the inference of the line, let alone whether it's actually being codified, to help you understand the relationship of objects. That's tremendously powerful, but that's not something many tools are doing. Peter, before I cut you off again.
Okay, I have a couple thoughts. One, going back to the possibility that they might not include visual meta in this year's conference proceedings, maybe we should introduce the idea of standoff visual meta, and then we could publish our own separate visual meta for the conference papers using a hash of the official ACM PDF of the paper, and then attach the rest of our visual meta to it to make up for them not including it in this year's conference proceedings. Also, I think it would be really nice to introduce the notion of an existent proof as an element in our VR worlds and our bibliographies. Now, specifically, I'm currently reading a book called Fair Management, The Story of a Century of Progress, A Guide for Future Fairs. And it's a history of the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair. And the book is a very detailed description of how the actual fair management operations went. Now, one of the elements buried in there is the reference to the fair management team having created a 35-foot long list of items that needed to be done to bring a full fair to execution. So we know somewhere that there's a list, typed list, that runs 35 pages that includes every single element needed to create a new World's Fair. Presumably some of them wouldn't be relevant in the future, but we know that this list exists. It didn't have any formal citation in the text, merely that somewhere out there in the world, and we can hope that the people who are managing archives connected to that fair somewhere preserve that 35-foot list. And it would be really nice if we could create a representation of the fact that we know this historical artifact did exist at one point in time. And if anyone can ever find it, we'd really like them to link back to us and tell us how we can get to it. So the fact that there's an existence proof alone has value to the academic community, because now some scholar who's interested in the history of World's Fairs, knowing that this 35-foot list exists out there, might start researching the problem of how to find it, ask people the right questions, or maybe someone who's writing their memoirs would find out that there's a list out there that people are interested in.
It's sort of like an unpopulated endpoint in that, well, it has a definition as an endpoint, but it doesn't attach to anything yet because the thing has not yet been found to make that attachment, if I understand correctly.
Your first, the first point though, Peter, sorry. We don't need to have standoff visual meta, because in Reader, if you open a document that has a DOI on the first page, it uses scholarly.com and Crossref to try to find the BibTeX for that document and appends it for you automatically if you approve that. So to get normal basic,
very good.
Yes, so that's, thank you. That's really, really easy. The only reason we did it officially was, for the official flavor of it, but also hoping that the next stage would be other metadata such as headings, which of course we cannot get through that method.
Just quickly, I recall when we were talking last, and Bob Portner is here. Scholarly was the name I was trying to. Has he been in a meeting where that was mentioned? Because he was talking about summarization stuff, and it occurs to me that that was the name I couldn't remember. That they're doing summarization.
Yeah, they do absolutely amazing stuff. And Phil is a really, really nice guy and very
So
much.
you might want to just point that to Bob then. I mean, I'm happy to do it, but you know them better, so you could probably give a sort of better description, and you actually know the guy who runs it. I think.
Yeah, no, we can do that.
Scholar seat.
Yeah, let me give you the URL. Oh, I'm pasting it in that chat here, but yeah, here it is.
Oh yeah, cool. Oh, one of the things that I was wanting to say about 2D versus 3D is that hypertext, for all its the current sort of HTML hypertext, for all its flaws, one of the things that has been really useful is that it actually doesn't have explicit encodings of the position of elements within it. People can hint and nudge, and you can turn on an absolute coordinate system, but the ability to create constraint-driven layouts and the so-called responsive web is dependent on not having those things in there. And so it's one of the challenges is that with the coordinate frames is that sometimes when you start encoding positions, it starts to look like you mean more than you do by having those things as positions in space, because there are times when it doesn't matter where things are, and then there are times that it does. And I don't know that there's a particularly good. I don't think that there are many domains in which people have a solid representation of when for example, positions matter and when they don't. And I think that's an interesting question within the context of sort of spatialized information manipulated and navigated in 3D, is that I think that there's a pretty clear case for both. Whereas like, I very much want this to be here, thank you. And then, well, it just has to exist. It just has to exist, and it has to be in a place, but you know, it's not that big a deal for me. And so I think, whereas, you know, in 3D modeling, everything Pixar does, they really want to make sure that the gravy is not just the right color, but in the right place. There's no sort of laissez-faire sort of about it. So yeah, I think that text is a really interesting, and information is perhaps, if not unique, then at least the first to be in a position where positions may matter but may not. And so there's this concept of potentially weighting, as in EIGHT, of when things matter like that and when they don't, and being able to kind of configure views based on how much you want to sort of accede to the expectations and demands of the document versus when you want to take it over.
So that goes directly to you walking and thinking in your garden.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that in your garden, you have a Future Text Lab wall, and you want to put up relevant stuff from different things people have written in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a case where location really matters.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so I guess in a case like that, it would be removed from the original document and it would be owned by the new environment, but it would have the citation information of whence it came from, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to be able to share it with people, and unless I'm willing to dig up parts of my garden and send it to them, then they'd have a hard time sort of making sure that that the relationships are obeyed. So there are sort of relative coordinate frames where somebody may want to put down, like, where's going to be your anchor for this? Where's going to be your anchor for that? In order to be able to kind of repopulate it.
Yeah, anchor, and also ability to, the more I think about it, and we talked about the Nelson lines, hiding stuff becomes more and more important because it becomes so easy, messy. Okay.
But it's funny as you're talking that it's this idea. I could sort of see you, you know, in your large space of being able to sort of put your hand in a pot of information, literally throw it against the wall, and out comes the thing you handled, and all the things that attach to it by links, and then, you know, which would pull them forth. but wouldn't
Right.
necessarily be rendered in the observation space. And in the view spec sense, being able to say with that same data set, just to cut it into a basically a left-right time line for sake of argument, or to band it to move the people and things into different things, which is very sort of, to me, quite view spec-y manipulation. But underneath, you still got your your skein of information, which says to me that actually the sort of the resting state where it's not being manipulated by a view state probably has to be recorded, even if it has no intrinsic worth. But in other words, if you do that, the only thing you ever are left with are where the view spec thought it was, which is fine, but it's probably never that's not where you want to go back to, because otherwise you always end up in a render, which I think is unhelpful, because the render implies something that your mind is now not thinking. Whereas you want to be able to go back to things, say, no, my space, my layout. And the other thing is we're living in the shadow of an awful lot of perhaps misused force directed graphs, which is something we're going to have to fight through. In the sense that I think it does two things. One is it gives us mental ideas of how things might look, which are based on no more than the thing used to render them. And that's difficult enough if you understand how it works, and even more difficult if it's still just magic. But I think one thing it really derails is this sort of very small h hypertextual view of things, with often the explicit or implicit linkage between things, and being able to view those relationships rather than some gnarly hard-edged algorithm saying, right, you will go and stand over in that corner because your weighting is less than this. And that's sort of not really, I think, how we think.
Right. So these different spaces, if it's about the thing or the room, is of course very important. And what I'm wondering is if our recent discussion of table of contents and covers comes into this, because maybe what the visual meta should only do is stuff about itself. So if you turn this out and you move it to the side and you do all that, you're making a new shape of this digital thing. So that's completely legitimate to have it save as a visual meta. So when you open the document again, it's all things sticking out or whatever it might be, right? And that should then be different from if you put it against the wall. So maybe we need an action where, let's say you have a glossary term and you move it there, that's one thing. But if you tear it off and slam it, so to speak, then now it's owned by the environment. These kinds of thresholds will be interesting. Brendel, I'm sure you have perspectives on that.
Yeah, there are some really interesting sort of investigations of the way our expectations of inertia and mass and threshold speeds work. So there's a really neat game it's for Vive. Well, it's for PC VR called Fantastic Contraption, sort of a play on the older game, The Incredible Machine, which itself was sort of Rube Goldberg. I don't know what British people call Rube Goldberg devices.
I know the thing.
Rube Goldberg.
I remember the PC game of the Incredible Machine.
Right. So Fantastic Contraption was a flash game in the in the noughts, and that Colin Northway, the developer of it, then I guess maybe was contracted or something to build a virtual reality version of it, and it's gorgeous. It's a wonderful experience. Unfortunately, I don't think it's been ported to Quest yet, so you'd need a PC to be able to play it. But one of the things that was really neat about it is you move stuff around, but if you threw it, then it would just go over the side of the island that you're on and disappear out into the world. And I've never tried to explore the threshold between the sort of hiffing stuff versus sort of positioning it, if there was some velocity there. I guess it could be, but yeah, I think that the sort of like being able to ascribe certain semantic meanings to certain velocities and relationships from one space to the other and projections thereof. I think they're all really fertile pieces to explore for what makes sense and what's natural versus what's learnable and useful within the expressive constraints of the system. because the other thing about all of these things is that a lot of people sort of swear black and blue that if it's not easy to do immediately, then it's not worth doing. But I think about how unintuitive Photoshop is and how much value people get out of it. And if you're going to make a Photoshop for VR text, then maybe it's going to be a bit difficult. Yeah.
I can't actually comment on how difficult Photoshop is because I started Photoshop version 2.
Yeah.
So it wasn't very complicated then, but feature creep in Photoshop has been positive because it actually gives us further capabilities. But your point, of course, stands very strongly. But I think this will have to, in some way, be one of our real experimental things. And Adam, I expect you're listening to this. So some of the things you talked about, hands and gestures, we could, like with the Ted Nelson legs, there's no reason we can't, click here to get scissors and cut them, right? If we want to get rid of them, we can play with really banal ways of doing it. And then we could maybe, you stare at it for too long, it'll start burning or whatever. Something useful will come out of that. But we have to define new closeness and distance in this space. And it's just insane what the four of us, because I'm talking about the four in the room now, get to actually think about. Because if you go back 20 years about this is pure speculative science fiction. And now we get to look at the actual implementations. It's just super wild.
Yeah, that was the thing that struck me when I was looking through Bob Horn's book over the weekend and seeing the bits on virtual reality and the way in which it might be usable. The fact that he sort of says, well, wireframe is possible now, and higher end systems are able to render things in Technicolor, and it's by no means trivial to be able to produce something like Word Reality, but I did do it, and it was a matter of weeks, not months, and that's one person just sort of chipping away at it. So a spirited, concerted effort from a team of people, come sort of with a combination of tools and talent to be able to do it, would be able to get a great deal more done. It's funny, I was just thinking about, I have yet to go through more of the ACM hypertext proceedings, but it just seems like and forgive me, but it seems like a lot of the appeal of what hypertext has kind of fallen off for large swathes of the population. It's just as these technical capabilities have actually started to appear, it's sort of become incredibly unappealing as things, just by virtue of the fact that it's possible. It's a shame.
Yeah, that's absolutely what's going on. And it's funny, when something becomes real, then it becomes no longer magic. And it's so easy to think and fantasize without repercussions. Now the repercussions are looming so large. But one thing then, Brandel, maybe we can get together during the week or write something, you reply or something on visual meta in these environments would be constrained around the object itself, forgetting the rest of the room for now, because that probably isn't a visual meta thing, it's other stuff. But we then combine the two things of making a cover, like a sculpture. We take the table of contents out here, we do this, that, and the other. It looks absurd as a 2D thing, but in the room, you can really see what it is. With the other thing we talked about, how can we encode the author pointing, turning pages, speaking, all of that stuff? What is the manner that could be encoded? Because even if the actual audio is stored on a server, but if the transcribed audio and reference to where it is in the visual meta, that means that we can have just the incredibly richest representations where it's possible, but we have whatever else. I don't know. Does that sound like something interesting to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of stepping through. It's sort of very similar to. I don't know if you've seen Chalk Talk. It's Ken Perlin's thing. It's what I asked Barbara about. But very, very interesting as a sort of a pedagogical tool for the most part, and with a fairly explicit sort of classroom bent. But so it's for sort of discovering, producing, and relaying things more or less along the lines of what, you have stuff in your head, you're kind of conjuring aspects of it. But I think it would be interesting to think about what Chalk Talk is for a book, what it is for being able to introduce those things.
Do you have a
that you have-
reference? Can you put it in chat?
Sure, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll find. He's done a bunch of presentations of it. I mean, there are. Yeah, there you go. Chalk Talk in augmented reality. It has remained thin conceptually. It's very appealing, very, very exciting. But in terms of like the actual content that you can get through with it, it has remained thin. And that's always dangerous, because it means that nobody's come up with a good enough reason to expand its use case into something that somebody really needs to do.
Well, the thing is, sorry, please go on. Sorry.
It just worries me because for the most part, it's only when tools are good enough that people can use it for their own thing that it's going to take off and do stuff. I've been sort of comparing different declarative models for how people are trying to envision something a little bit more document-like and less imperative programming language, like for 3D web, because there was one called A-Frame, and I know the people well who make it, but aspects of it didn't feel right. But it's also like in terms of the stuff that people succeeded in doing with it doesn't look great, and that's suggestive that people who have tried found that it doesn't solve their needs. And there's one that I like a lot less, React, the thing that Facebook is powered by for the most part. But it really does appear to be letting people make things that are good, and so it may grudgingly have to accept that they have a point. But yeah, so Chalk Talk is much more the former, in that it's very visually impressive. But I'm not aware of anybody other than Perlin having succeeded in making a go of it for doing anything. And for the most part, he's sort of largely in Ivan Sutherland's camp of, I don't know if you've seen Ivan Sutherland talk about Sketchpad, but he says the only useful thing that was ever produced in it was the drawings for his PhD and some hexagons his mother wanted him to make once. It's terrifying as a creator of a tool to hear that. I mean,
yes.
He's aware of and is, I think, made peace with the fact that his sole claim to fame is inventing computer graphics and virtual reality, and it's probably good enough. But it would have been nice for the tool to do something good.
You walk out and they say, "Oh, lovely, darling," and put it straight on the fridge and then go on with what they were doing earlier. Yeah.
I don't think he ever found out what the hexagons were for, but
I did think
make work.
One of the reasons, the things I sent you, one of the reasons I sent you Home Computer Revolution, which is hardly seen these days. It occurred to me that a goodly number of things came to pass. So that might be an interesting exploratory sort of demo-y type thing. So, here's the Sage of Sausalito. So how did it go?
So the thing about this, sorry, just bulldozing. You and Adam Brandel, you like to do demos and you don't like to write, and that's absolutely fine. But I look at Mark's Scottish trousers there; they're hilarious. Sorry, that's just the comedy interlude we needed. Anyway, right. So what I could imagine is, I think what can potentially happen here can be really, really useful for people in the future. And I don't want us to just have a few YouTube videos in VR. That's what you've been doing, Brandel, and that's fantastic. But I think more of what you do needs to be recorded for the long term. So I could imagine that you go in and you do a talk of what you're doing. Forget an initial document. The document could be as short as a paragraph of a summary of what it is. It could even be, it's 1 a.m., I'm looking at this thing, I don't know what the heck it is. But then your interaction with it can be stored in this way that it's quite frozen for the future for people in different ways to go back. So that's why I think we should try to work on a specific way of putting it like that.
The good thing is if you speak, then your words will be forever slightly badly machine translated into text for you.
Yes, no, I'm aware of the sort of the benefits and flaws of that. I don't know if you ever saw auto dictate, but it's a very simple thing that it's almost useful for me.
Yeah.
It should work still. Yeah. Okay. So it's this thing here. It works out. It's only for Chrome, but you can have that on Mac as well, because Safari hasn't yet exposed the speech and the API, or it maybe doesn't intend to. I'm not sure. But the idea for this is that if you click the record and then you say stuff, then it'll come up, and when you go below the threshold volume, then it stops recording, and you start another section as you get it, as it sort of finds it, and then you can click on those words, click on those sentence fragments, and hear them. So if there's any transcription errors, then you can go in and manipulate those because they are text content editable. I found that to be a useful sort of halfway point between having the ability to speak and get something out, and also completely losing the thread of when things are mistranscribed, because there are a lot of times when the mistranscription of one or two words obscures the entire sort of meaning of the paragraph.
Isn't it amazing
document.
How little is needed? That's what I found when I tried using, because I'm a really slow typist, I tried using dictation software. And the trouble is it lulls you into a sense of security, and say you keep on talking without checking, and suddenly you've got 2 paragraphs of I can't even figure out what it is.
Exactly. And so one of the things, so you're forced into one of 2 modes. Devil may care, and whether you get what you get, and you can make use of it is sort of up to the sort of winds of time. Or you work in a defensive mode where you're constantly verifying, but neither of those is particularly usable. So this is hopefully sort of a hedge between those, where you have the specific sentence fragments that you can click on and hear the specific things, and hopefully that's enough of that, like I said, context restoration, that you have some sense of what it is that it might be, if it didn't record the specific thing itself. So the reason why I bring this up, Rhoda, is because I want to put it in VR, obviously. It's my solution to everything. So one of the next things that would go along with it is the ability to encode the gesture that accompanies speech, as well as the ability to have those things. So you can put that speech in places, you can move those things around, and you can have accompanying kind of gesture, potentially, to take a leaf out of Perlin's book there with Chalk Talk, maybe draw things, but it's by no means a necessity to get it to be worthwhile. But that's kind of one of the things that I'm envisioning. Why I sort of bring up that in the context of your sort of asking about a book or a document, that Perlin sort of starts from a blank slate for the most part, rather than having materials that he intends to relate to. They implicitly exist insofar as he's got that cool little bird that he draws, and then it walks around and it does cool stuff. But it's not that he doesn't have an explicit palette that he's drawing from. So I think you're presenting a book or a document, a corpus of explicit agenda. It might be possible to have some kind of representation of that, both from the perspective of user expectations, as well as from the perspective of having it easier to be able to kind of author an environment such that you can pull this out, pull that out, perform this at this time. Because the issue with Perlin's thing as it currently exists is that he's got the cool bird thing, he's got the time series, the pendulum. Sorry, you haven't seen it yet. But he doesn't have a million things, right? He doesn't even have 100 things. And so, you need to be able to kind of manage the scale and complexity as it becomes more than beyond a toy to an arbitrary presentation device. Do you have specific and uniquely identifiable gestures for those things? Or do you have to have an explicit palette that you kind of make use of for those things? So yeah, really, really interesting work. Really limited in terms of the explicit scope that it can kind of address at this point. And I think that there's something really interesting within the context of virtual presentation of visual meta powered sort of components.
I just put a name in chat that I'd rather you don't speak.
Sure.
So this is someone who has been very supportive over the years of the work and is in our book. So that narrows it down a bit. Imagine this person with a new book, because he's very much into tech, and the first iPad books, he was one of the first to do something interesting there. Imagine having him in as an avatar going through his book, maybe even reading it for you, not just audio, but turning the pages, highlighting things, right? If we can manage to find a way to encode that, that can be amazing.
Right, and the authorship aspect of it, how onerous it is or isn't. I think director's commentary for all of the sort of the middle of the road and downright poor author's commentary and director's commentary that accompanies DVD features. I think if you had a more amenable sort of context in which people can kind of relay thoughts and anecdotes and create artifacts and pull them out, I think that there are some really, really rich opportunities there. And I don't mean in a commercial sense, but I don't not mean in a commercial sense either, of the things that people can do based on the things that exist in their spaces and the pieces that they have to hand as a consequence of the other media that they've created. So yeah, that would be really exciting to play with.
It could be
I'm glad
amazing.
that you feel like you have his ear.
And also the commentaries, yes. I mean, just imagine watching a nature documentary and having, a lot of people watch movies in Oculus now or equivalent, being able to literally go behind it. Right. By the way, Peter, before you speak, I have to tell you something. I bought the ultralight Oculus flight simulator, which came out yesterday. Spent £15, something like $20 on it. Lost it 15 seconds. Got completely sick. Had to take my headset off.
Jumped off the roof, didn't go well. Yes.
No, I mean, in VR, if I don't move, I don't want the world to move. So I think we're on a similar page. Anyway, Peter, what did you have to say?
Yeah, another unpopular endpoint thought. Maybe we could find some work done in the area of stage direction from the theatrical community that could be applied to describing how we want avatars to move around in a compact format. I'm just sort of like assuming that there might actually be somewhere out there a taxonomy and standard phrases that directors would use and embed in screenplays to describe the kinds of motions and gestures that you might want to have applied to an avatar. And if we had that language, then we could map that to skeletal motions in a standard stick figure VR model that could then be applied to any of our avatars. But I don't know if anything like that exists. But if we knew someone who was involved in the stage theatrical community, we might be able to ask them, and they might say, oh, there's a standard reference book that talks about exactly that problem. Here's what you need to go read. So it's an unpopulated endpoint, but if we could find someone who overlapped that area, we might be able to get a good pointer.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that sounds really, really productive as an opportunity to play with. I also, my brother was one of the lead pre-visualization artists on a couple of small indie flicks, Lord of the Rings and Batman and Harry Potter and Bridget Jones 2, The Edge of Reason for some reason. So he has a pretty good experience of all of the different sort of pieces of the way that movies go together and the kind of collateral that's produced there. I'm not aware of whether he's been involved in DVD productions of the sort of the meta information of a film, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there too.
Just on that interest, that's very impressive. Many years ago, when the whole DVD thing was happening, I wrote a letter to the DVD standards organization in Japan suggesting that they add a thing whereby you could film a scene that'll take exactly the same amount of time, but you film it from slightly different angles or slightly different dialogue, and it would randomly play one of them. You wouldn't have any control. It's based on the joke that two friends are watching a movie, a cowboy movie, says, I bet you $5 that horse is going to fall soon. Yeah, I bet you $5 is fine. The horse falls. He says, I'm sorry, I have to admit I've seen the movie. And the other guy says, yeah, me too. I didn't think the horse would be that stupid twice.
Yes.
Right. But that could happen. But, to go into the thing about multimedia production, like the work with your brother, that's absolutely amazing, huge budget. But if you're able to do it with just yourself, with just your gestures and your voice, like we're talking about here, that is literally transformative. imagine some of the great teachers in history saying, here's my book on so-and-so. Let me tell you this. Oh, by the way, let's just put down the book and I will talk it through, but the book is here. It's amazing. I got to cut off pretty soon too. But yeah, Brandel, maybe I try to write something and I send it to you, or
Yeah. I'll read the thing that you sent through earlier as well. It's I think we're sort of coming toward a little less of the talking in circles that you mentioned, Mark. I hope, and I feel like there are some really interesting sort of directions that some of these things are pointing in. If you'd like, I can mark stuff up with some positions and things like that. But it's really if all you're talking about is positions, then it's just visual meta plus positions. But it strikes me that that's actually simultaneously too much and too little information for a range of needs. And so a better enunciation of those needs is at least as useful as the sort of the solution that a specific representation would kind of give rise to. And thank you, Mark, for your kind discussion of credentialism. I will say that it's not my I have pretty good commercial credentials. I'm not worried about that. It's just that the relevance of those credentials in the context of the discussions we have is the thing that I find challenging. It's just like, I worked for Coca-Cola, also thinks about text.
Yeah. Now, I just conscious also that two of us have just been sort of wading through the nightmare of thesis, and it crops up only because it's what's in the hopper at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great session, guys. See you on Friday.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
very good.
Yeah, Peter.
Thanks, everyone. This is layers and layers to talk about. I think we may not be getting close to project, but we're getting closer to understanding what the room is, so to speak. The room where it happens.
Yeah. I'll link just so everybody has the link to Horn's book as well, because I think it's great. I'd love to check with him as whether he wants people to. It's on archive.org. I'd love to check with him if he has a preferred way of people getting it, because it seems like it's out of print. And so if he's okay, having people kind of point to it, I'd love to tweet about it and some of the observations from it. But I can email him directly.
It's depressing. So many of my books come from university libraries, which I can demand, which says something itself.
This book is right there, but that doesn't help this discussion. If it was virtual, we could have this discussion all over again. But
right, exactly.
Another really important thing is, I think we need to make this into a core needle focal point for what we're talking about. And I know you agree on that. But I think we should also need to invite more people. We talked about Maggie last week, which is great. You're in dialogue with her. But if there's other people that you feel are doing great work in this, just get them in. We'll put them on a pedestal and really listen to them, giving good, dialogue. Because in a year, if we have a bit of a real, I've always seen myself as an artist, creator, and all of that stuff. But that's not what I can give the world right now. I have to just help the right people in the room record what they say.
Yeah.
Right. So we had this spreadsheet and we've had lots of talks, but if there's any people on this, just, feel free to invite without running it past anyone. Let's just make it.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. And thank you for having the nerve to invite Lanier to talk to him. I've never had the nerve to strike up conversations with people like that, but I think it would be fun if we did. There are some folks who have actually reached out to me explicitly about the sort of the idea of text and things. And I'm going to chat with them one-on-one and see if they want to come along at some point as well.
Because actually the useful thing now is also as it's sort of beginning to come into a slightly sort of tighter frame and sort of in terms of something that you might at least try and, put some vision to, is that it's easier possibly to bring some people in a sense, and then focus it around that and allow someone to sort of, either enjoy it or add to it or even just pull it apart, because they've seen things we haven't, and that could be tremendously useful too.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Gotta go. This is wonderful, and let's keep at it. Bye, guys.
Indeed.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.